Welcome to Your Family's Health, the program that focuses on healthcare issues with unique and different modalities for taking charge of your health today. Experts talk weekly with our continuing roster of guests from around the country and right here in Nassau County to keep you up to date on the latest health issues and trends. Take care of your mind, body, and soul. Spend the next half hour with the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC, and get on the journey to better health.
Hello and welcome to Your Family's Health. My name is Dr. Jeanine Cook-Garard from the Nursing Department here at Nassau Community College, along with Caleb Garard, second-year medical school student. And today we're going to talk about the topic that everyone has questions about, the COVID-19 vaccines. Our guest is Dr. Richard Webby, a faculty member in the Infectious Diseases Department at St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital and a member of the World Health Organization Influenza Vaccine Composition Advisory Team. We should note that all of the information being given today is as of March 10th, which is the date we are recording this interview today. And we realize that information regarding both COVID and the COVID vaccines are constantly changing. So Dr. Webby, welcome to Your Family's Health on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Jeanine.
So first of all, I hope you're personally doing all right during this pandemic. And how has this virus affected you personally?
Yeah, so we're doing okay right now. I guess the case numbers are low in our community, just luckily like they are through most of the US. But our daily activities have been very much affected by this virus, sort of both at the home life, but also here sort of in the lab at St. Jude where I work as well. We've had sort of reduced numbers of people in the lab. So, at least the capacity we have to do what we used to do at least 13 months ago has been reduced just like everybody else.
So Dr. Webby, please tell us a little bit about your background and how you became a part of the World Health Organization.
Sort of my story, as you may tell from the way I speak, I'm not from the US. I was a New Zealander. I did my PhD in New Zealand and got interested in viruses there and sort of looked for positions to continue my career looking at viruses, particularly with a public health focus. And I ended up here at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital working for sort of one of the giants in the area of influenza, Robert Webster. And he was director of the WHO Collaborating Center here at St. Jude. He has since retired, but sort of long story short, I came to St. Jude some 20 years ago to work, train for 2 or 3 years and move on. And sort of as you can tell, I'm still here. I guess just sort of took over the reins of the WHO Collaborating Center here probably 10 or so years ago now. And so that was sort of how I came into this position, really from a perspective of having a research interest in viruses, how they cause disease, how we can better prepare against them, and sort of luckily found my way to a place where I had the opportunity to contribute to the World Health Organization sort of global influenza preparedness efforts.
So as of today, we see that there are 3 different vaccines available to fight against the COVID-19 virus. So can you tell us the difference between the Pfizer, the Moderna, the Johnson & Johnson? What is the difference? What should we be looking to get? Was one better than the other?
Yeah, so that's sort of the
loaded question.
Yeah, exactly right. So is one better than the other? And you would think the answer to that would be pretty easy to get at, but the truth is it's not really. So I think it's been a remarkable effort, sort of to go back a little bit, at the global response to this pandemic in terms of vaccines has just been phenomenal. Sort of the kitchen sink has been thrown at this problem, and a number of things have actually come out and been pretty successful. Comparing that to influenza, where, essentially we've had the same vaccine for decades that
Yes.
has changed a little bit, but not really much. And if we look at the three vaccines you talked about, the Pfizer, the Moderna, the Johnson & Johnson, these are all sort of cutting-edge technologies that haven't been used previously, at least on wide scale in human vaccines. So again, that on its own is sort of a remarkable feat, and I think it's really exciting for the field of vaccinology as a whole, moving forward past this. But going back to your real question, so there's really two categories of vaccine in those three that we mentioned. The Moderna and Pfizer are both based on mRNA vaccine. So the way these vaccines work is we introduce mRNA, which is the way our host cells normally produce proteins. So we introduce an mRNA that instructs the cells in your body to make some of the proteins or one of the proteins from the coronavirus, and that's how we induce immunity to it. So both the Pfizer and Moderna mRNA, we inject them into your arm, they get taken up by your cells produce this spike protein from the coronavirus. Your body recognizes that and starts making antibodies and T cells and B cells and the works. So those two vaccine platforms are pretty similar. I mean, there's some subtleties and differences in terms of how much RNA each of those has, whether there's 2 or 3 weeks in between your doses, et cetera, et cetera. But, functionally, they're essentially the same vaccines. The other one from Johnson & Johnson is actually a little bit different. So it sort of relies on that same principle that we want our host cells to be making these virus proteins to stimulate our immune response. But the way that vaccine goes about it is it essentially hijacks a crippled common cold virus, a virus called an adenovirus, which typically will cause common colds, much like some of our seasonal coronaviruses, actually. But what these investigators have done have taken that common cold virus, they've crippled it so it can't cause disease, but then they've also essentially spliced into that virus that gene that again makes that protein from the coronavirus. And so again, when we get injected with that vaccine, it's kind of the same principle, but this time we utilize that adenovirus, that crippled cold virus, to get that gene into your host cells and start that process again. So again, two quite different platforms in terms of how they work, the mRNA or the adenovirus vaccines, but they're both incredibly successful. One of the key differences between those two also is the Johnson & Johnson is a single dose vaccine. So, for many people that has some advantages. You don't have to go back for your second dose. It has also some benefits in terms of stability. So the Moderna and the Pfizer do require cold storage. That's not as important for the Johnson & Johnson product. So pluses and minuses for those. Again, the real question is, is one going to protect you more than the other? It's really hard to know that right now. If you look at the data from the clinical trials for these, it did appear that the messenger RNA, so the Moderna and Pfizer products, gave slightly better results. But we've also got to think that at the time when those vaccines were tested, it was very, very early on in the pandemic. We didn't have all these variants running around. And so the viruses that they had to protect against were not very diverse, whereas when the Johnson & Johnson product was tested, there were a few more of these variants running around, so they had a slightly tougher job to do. So back to your real question, the best vaccine to get is the one that you can get and the one that you can get quickest. We could go backwards and forwards on whether one is better or not, but bottom line is these are incredibly effective vaccines overall, and I would absolutely recommend taking whichever one you can get first.
So do you think that people should be holding out to try to get one vaccine over the other? Like you said before, all the vaccines are effective. So should people try and opt out to get one vaccine over another, or just kind of get what's available to them? Yeah,
so I think it's kind of the answer to that is I think whatever people can get, particularly right now, I think where there's still an overall shortage of vaccine. So certainly if it was my personal my personal choice, I would absolutely line up and get the first vaccine that I could. So I actually have been vaccinated. I actually had the Pfizer product because that was just what I could get access to first. But again, if you're an individual and you can bowl on up and get the Johnson & Johnson product tomorrow, then absolutely you should do that and not wait for, maybe the opportunity to get one of the other two.
Are the studies showing that after the vaccination, people are coming down with COVID symptoms with one vaccine over another? Or is it just across the board the same?
No, so if you look at the actual clinical trials from these vaccines, it did appear that these mRNA vaccines, so again, the Pfizer and the Moderna, were a little bit more effective in protecting from more mild forms of the disease. So that, they were really good across the board. The Johnson & Johnson product was really good at protecting from severe disease and was good at protecting from more mild disease, but again, not quite as good as the other two. But again, I want to come back to that point that these trials weren't done head to head. So it is a little bit, it's probably the wrong thing to do to try and compare the outputs from these different clinical trials when they were done in different populations at different times. Mm-hmm. So it really is, it's a bit challenging to directly compare them with the data we have now. Clearly, as we move forward, we're going to get more data. Maybe the answer to that question will be a little clearer later on. But right now, all of these vaccines that we can get in the US have done an incredibly good job. So
once someone is fully vaccinated, how soon can they return to their normal activities of daily living and become social and participate in gatherings, social gatherings?
Right. So again, I think that just this week, the CDC, of course, has come out with some guidance on that as well. So, these vaccines are great. So what at least we would think is that once you're vaccinated, your chances of contracting disease and getting sick is very low. Probably your chance of getting infected at all and transmitting is low as well. But it's that last point we don't really have a good handle on yet. We fully expect these vaccines to protect vaccinated people from getting an infection and transmitting it, but we don't have that real data yet. So, that's why we're going to continue to hear these messages. Yes, you got vaccinated, that is great, but let's continue for a little bit longer to do these mask wearing, a little bit of social distancing as much as we can. I think that's as much until we get a little bit more data so we can be 100% confident in saying, okay, you're good to go. But, clearly this week the CDC has loosened their guidelines a little bit and has suggested that certainly vaccinated people can interact socially in smaller groups and also potentially with unvaccinated people, so long as that unvaccinated people are sort of obeying social distancing guidelines, etc. as well. So again, back to answering what you really asked me, I think to continue with a little bit of social distancing, mask wearing, etc., even if you've had your 2 doses of vaccine, even if you're 2 weeks out from that, is still a good idea. But you're probably, it's a good idea, but you're probably good.
You're listening to Your Family's Health on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Dr. Jeanine Cook-Garard, along with Caleb Garard, who's a second-year medical student. And today we're learning about the COVID-19 vaccines with our guest, Dr. Richard Webby, a faculty member in the Infectious Disease Department at St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital and a member of the World Health Organization's Influenza Vaccine Composition Advisory Team. So, like experts like Dr. Fossey have said that 70-85% of the population needs to get vaccinated to reach herd immunity. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, it does seem to be somewhere in that general area is the key figure. These are, of course, they're estimates, so it could be a few percentage high, a few percentage lower, but it's generally thought that area is really the key to interrupting transmission of some of these respiratory viruses in the population. So I absolutely agree with those estimates.
When do you think that the United States will reach the level of immunization?
Unfortunately, I'm probably not the best one to answer that. It depends on how quickly we can get these vaccines out, which, of course, seems to be picking up, which is great. And certainly with the third product now having emergency use authorization by FDA, the Johnson & Johnson product, that's going to help immensely. I guess the other part of that is, which is even more uncontrollable, is how many people will actually take that vaccine, right? There is a certain percentage of the population who has some hesitancy against taking the vaccine, so that may play into this as well. So even if we get the vaccines out, can we actually get that 70% of the population to take it that we need to get herd immunity? But, I think we're certainly talking months rather than years. So, I think in the next few months, it does sound like we're going to get a decent chunk of the US population immunized. But we also, of course, got to keep in mind that's good for us domestically, but, we're well and truly ahead of most other parts of the world. And because this is a pandemic, by definition, it means it involves a global population. So I think for us all to return to normal, requires not just the US to reach that 70%, but the rest of the global population as well. And that's, of course, going to take a lot longer than this year and maybe even next year.
So talking on the global level, we've heard news about the different variants of the virus out of the UK, South Africa, and Brazil, for example. Have any of these vaccines been proven to be just as effective at fighting the variants as of today?
Right. So the three vaccines that we have in the US, there's a little bit of information on the effectiveness of the Johnson & Johnson product against some of these variants. And again, the effectiveness does drop, but it is still very effective against them. We have some more laboratory scale data on Pfizer and Moderna, just looking at antibodies that those vaccines induce in people. And essentially the way these studies are done, you'll take antibodies from people who have been immunized and then ask the question, how well those antibodies recognize essentially the viruses that are circulating, were circulating here 2 or 3 months ago, versus how well do those antibodies recognize these new variants. And when you do those studies, you do see there is a drop. So those antibodies don't recognize the variants quite as well, but they still do recognize them. So I think, what does that mean for the average person who's been immunized? They probably are still pretty well protected against those variants, but there's a bit more chance that if you're infected with these variants, that virus may replicate just a little bit more, maybe cause a few more sniffles perhaps. So I think the proof of the pudding is still to come on that, but the full expectations are, that these vaccines are going to be effective against them, maybe just a little bit less so, though.
So if I had my two vaccinations from either Moderna or the Pfizer, can I still get the full-blown COVID virus?
Expectations on vaccines, vaccines, or I guess any medical interventions really, are never 100% effective. So they're not always effective in all of the people all of the time. So there is always going to be some percentage of people, for whatever reasons, underlying conditions, they get infected with maybe a really weird strain where that vaccine may not work or may not work very well at all, and so you'll get breakthrough. But again, looking at the clinical trials for some of these, that's going to be very, very rare events. So yes, can happen, but we don't expect it to be very common at all. You may still get infected with the virus. So again, you may be fully vaccinated. You may get infected with the virus, but there's a really good chance you're not even going to know you're infected. So,
okay,
that your body's response is going to mean that can't cause disease. So you might get infected, but really for practical purposes, it's not going to impact you at all.
So what would you say to someone who's afraid to take the vaccine because of how fast it was created?
Again, I know there's a lot of hesitancy on this, and a lot of it is because of, as you said, Caleb, there's this thought that these were done rapidly. There was sort of corners, shortcuts taken in the approval of this. So yes, these were done in incredibly quick times, but I want to make the point that these are new technologies, but they're technologies that have been in development for decades. So the Johnson & Johnson product, that vaccine platform has been around for a couple of decades, probably. It was used in the response to the Ebola vaccine. So there is quite a bit of sort of clinical know-how, clinical information on that vaccine platforms before this came along. The mRNAs, again, a little bit newer, but again, it's in terms of other clinical trials against other infectious diseases, tens of thousands of people had received that already. So yes, these vaccines are new. Yes, they were done quickly, but it wasn't like the laboratory research started at the time of the pandemic and we went straight through into clinical trial. These had been in development for a long time. And the FDA sort of has plans for outbreaks like this, based a lot on actually flu. So they have these plans for when there's an emergency, how can we shorten these timelines? And typically the various steps in vaccine development, one happens after the other. So that takes time. But the types of things that happened during this pandemic was a lot of these things started in parallel. So you didn't wait for the results of one to start the other. So yes, these were done quick, remarkable achievement, but there really wasn't any safety shortcuts done, and everything that we would have wanted to see safety-wise for these vaccines, we saw those studies were done. So, I've got a lot of confidence in the safety of these vaccines, and so, of course, did the FDA and the panel that approved them. So, I understand the hesitancy and the concern, but there wasn't any safety shortcuts made in the development and approval of these vaccines.
So that's one of the myths, developing it fast. Now, there are a multitude of other myths. So can you please dispel any other myths that I know that you've heard of about this COVID vaccine? And there are many.
Yeah, there are some. I think one of the ones that we hear a lot, actually I've heard a few times been asked, is sort of a link between this vaccine and infertility. I think particularly from probably a group of people who have not yet.
You've heard of chips in the vaccines. I've heard of infertility. I've heard of so many different, scares that, what can you dispel for us?
Yeah, well, certainly. So the infertility, there is no link between this vaccine and infertility. And certainly, as much as I'm aware, no link between any viral vaccine and infertility. And there's nothing to suggest this vaccine is going to be any different in that regards. The chips in it, we're going to get infected and Bill Gates will be sort of selling our information to China and Russia. That technology, if we had it, would be incredible. But I don't think we have. The technology they went into these vaccines is great, but the technology to do that, of course, is, as far as I'm aware, is not available. And certainly these vaccines don't do it. I think one of the other ones I've heard about the mRNA is that it's going to sort of integrate into your DNA and change your DNA.
Correct. Yes.
Right. And that's, again, not so. The way these mRNA vaccines work is inside in your host cell, your DNA is in a nucleus, so sort of squirreled away inside a package. This mRNA doesn't actually get to the nucleus, so it doesn't even get to a point where it could interact with your host DNA. And they're actually designed, they're more effective the earlier or the further away they get from that part of the cell. So again, there's people have looked and have never found that even interaction between these mRNAs and host DNA. So again, that's one we can put a cross beside.
So, doctor, tell me about quarantining now. What are the guidelines for quarantining? It becomes very confusing. If I've been exposed to the COVID virus or someone that is positive COVID, how long should I quarantine?
Yeah, so you're dead right. And of course, it's going to get even more confusing as we get all these different stages of vaccination coming in and people have been infected before. So it is a continually moving target, and I would certainly suggest anyone who has questions to look at the CDC website or their own state websites as well. But sort of as of now, if you're a person who hasn't been infected before and you do come into contact with someone who tested positive for the virus, the recommendations are right now that you quarantine for 10 days. So that just means you sort of stay at home. You don't interact with other people, certainly outside your household. If you want to get out of that earlier, so you can actually get a test, a PCR test done. So it's one of the tests for COVID between day 5 and day 7 after that exposure. And that means you can actually, if that's negative, you can actually get out of quarantine at day 7. So again, if you're a person who hasn't been infected or you haven't been vaccinated, either 10 days without a test, 7 days with a test. If you've actually had the vaccine now, the latest recommendations from CDC, if you're had your 2 doses of the Pfizer or Moderna and you're beyond, I think it's 7 days past that second dose, or you've had your dose of Johnson & Johnson, and I'm not sure what the period post that is. But again, when you're fully vaccinated, you've had time post your last dose, then you don't have to quarantine at all now, even if you're exposed to someone who's been infected. So I think it's another really great reason to go and get that vaccine as well, so you don't have to be sort of tucked up at home for 10 days.
So how long does this vaccine work? I mean, does it last? Is it a yearly vaccination that I need to get, or is this every 2 years, every 3 years? What are we talking?
Simple answer to that is we don't know yet. Of course, we're not that far into it, but there's two things that come into that. One, is the immunity that this vaccine generates going to last a long time? That's one question, which, of course, the only way we're really going to know that is by immunizing people and waiting and to see. So, again, we're probably going to get some data on that soon. There are people who have been vaccinated for a number of months now. So people are studying those individuals, looking at their immunity and looking whether it goes up or down. The other part to this where we may need to get a different vaccine or a booster vaccine is if one of these variants emerges that is spreads very, very widely, and it does look like the vaccine isn't as effective or isn't effective against it. So that would be another reason where we might have to get a booster or a slightly different vaccine. At the moment, neither of those two have suggested we have to change our vaccination strategy or we have to get another booster vaccine. It's possible we will. It's not going to be like flu, though. It's not going to be where we have to get a new vaccine every year. This virus just doesn't behave like flu. Doesn't change as much. So I'm pretty confident that we're not going to be in a flu-like situation. But yeah, are we going to require another booster dose in 5 years? That I can't tell you.
So if someone wanted to get in contact with the updated guidelines for COVID, where can they go and how can they access your information? Yeah,
so by far the best single source for this is the US CDC website. Of course, they put out the recommendations for the US. I'd also suggest you do go to your state websites as well, because sometimes the state recommendations are a little bit different from CDC. And certainly, from my information, who I am, head to St. Jude Children's Research Hospital website and have a look around.
So thank you for being here, Dr. Richard Webby, faculty member in the Infectious Disease Department at St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital and a member of the World Health Organization Influenza Vaccine Composition Advisory Team. We hope you stay safe and continue to stay healthy. And thank you for being our guest today.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.
This is Dr. Jeanine Cook-Garard from the Nursing Department here at Nassau Community College, along with Caleb Garrard, second-year medical student. And we want to thank you for listening to this week's edition of Your Family's Health.
We'd like to get your feedback on your family's health. Send your comments by emailing them to whpc@ncc.edu. Podcasts of today's show are available on iTunes, Android Podcasts, and Spreaker. This program was produced at the studios of Nassau Community College in cooperation with the Nursing Department. Join us next week for another edition of Your Family's Health on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.